Hello.
Hello.
This is Stephen Palmer and Rich Wandel.
Actually, it's Wandel.
Wandel. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And today is July 25th, 2018, and we're conducting an interview for the Stonewall Oral History Project. Rich, in sort of a modified oral history fashion, I'd like to ask you about your childhood, mom,
Sure.
dad, brothers, sisters, where you were born, religion, and so on, and then I'll bring that into sexual awareness, and then continue that on to the matter at hand. So, if you will.
Sure. My grammar school years were in Queens, New York City, in Ozone Park. My parents, well, I guess, middle class or something like that is what that neighborhood was at the time, and certainly what we were. My mother did some work at home to supplement income. My father was an accountant at that point, although earlier on he had been a photographer. But you have to make a living, as it were, with 5 kids ultimately. All right. So I was actually born in Wisconsin, but moved to New York, to Queens at about the age of 1 or something like that.
What year were you born?
I was born in 1946, May of 46. So that was, and I went to parochial school, Catholic school, and then later to Catholic high school. When I was in the 8th grade, we moved out to Long Island, the suburbs. It was one of these places where they literally cleared it all to flat ground and then built a development. So it was pretty sterile, at least at first. Probably not so sterile any longer, but certainly at the time.
What town did you move to?
Deer Park, which is in Suffolk County, but just barely. So I went 1 year back into Brooklyn to go to high school at St. John's Prep, but then quickly, for reasons of convenience, that was a long trip, switched to St. Anthony's in Smithtown. At that time, it was a school of only 300 students. My graduating class had, I think, 77 in it.
Small for the baby boom.
Yes. Definitely it was a small Franciscan school. It's not that small anymore. In more recent years, they went co-ed, and they're in what used to be a diocesan high school in Huntington. I only know that because I get letters, So it was a small school. It was still maybe a 20-mile commute in the morning by school bus. Oftentimes in the afternoon, because of doing other activities, I would hitchhike home, actually, those 20 miles. That could be done in those days.
This is the early 60s?
I graduated in 1963, so yes. After that, I entered the monastery, seminary, of an order known as the Passionists. And so I did all my college years there. Plus a novitiate, plus 1 year of graduate school with them before they kind of kicked me out.
Talk to me about what brought you to that. What was that calling about?
I think, for me anyway, why one does that is actually pretty complicated, and part of it is unconscious. All right. Certainly on the conscious level, and truly so, it has to do with various altruistic motives. Certainly I was, and still am, although in a different way now, a religious person. And there's the idea of helping. On an unconscious level, it is an all-male grouping. And also on an unconscious level, I think it's a false idea that you could avoid the question of sexuality. But going into any kind of a monastery is no way to avoid anything. It is ultimately quite the opposite, right? But I think those factors are in there. It was a very different time in the 1960s. For example, I remember very clearly in the senior religious class in high school, was referred to as a marriage class, but it was their version of sex ed, all right? And in those days, graduating in 1963, jerking off was a mortal sin. You could go to hell for that, all right? And of course, I was a teenager. That's like 3 times a day at least, all right? And
It's a lot of mortal sin.
a lot of mortal sin and a lot of feeling guilty about it, okay? But I do remember somebody in class asked, well, what happens if you have a wet dream? And the brother teaching the class said, well, there's no volition in that, so there's no problem. There's no, no problem. So somebody else, probably thinking to be a wise guy, says, well, what happens if you wake up in the middle of it? And this teacher actually said that if you took pleasure in it at that point, it would be a mortal sin. But if you kind of said, oh no, then you were okay. And it was a clear indication to me that the sin was in the pleasure, which made no sense. All right, I won't say from that day on I understood that it made no sense. It was kind of at that point a moment of clarity and then forgetting about it again, as one often does. All right, but by being a seminarian, in a way, very much helped prepare me to leave it all behind. Because if you're studying philosophy and theology, even in a Catholic institution in 1960-something, right, it's still very different than being the guy in the pew, all right, listening to a sermon on a Sunday morning. A sermon on Sunday morning would have you believe that it's absolutely clear and certain that it's a human being from the moment of conception, and therefore abortion is murder. If you study theology, you learn things like Thomas Aquinas, the great, be-all and end-all Thomas Aquinas, actually said, we have no way of knowing, therefore we must err on the side of caution. Okay, that's a big difference. That's a very big difference. And similarly, in other things, if you study history, you learn things like in the Middle Ages, the belief was that the entire new baby was in the male sperm, and the female body was only a safe place for it to develop. That makes masturbation the same as abortion. All right, and they don't talk about it. But so actually, in a strange way, by going into the heart of the beast, if you will, it prepared me to say, now wait a minute, because it is not nearly as cut and dried as you would find being just a guy in the pew.
Let me just ask you, the years, I think, is it 62 to 64, 63 to 65, the Second Vatican Council
Indeed.
happening, and this predates liberation theology by 6 years still, but was that liberalization of the church something that you recognized or you had a sense of?
More than recognized. People of my age, my classmates, and myself, were just exuberant about it, to say the least. Primarily in terms of liturgy and vernacular in the liturgy, but also an understanding, for example, of the schema on religious liberty, which was largely written by the American Jesuit Courtney Murray. Prior to that, Catholicism has always said that religious freedom was wrong and shouldn't be, all right? So here you had the Vatican Council, Vatican II, coming out with a document saying, no, that's quite fine. Virtually everything of Vatican II has been taken back, with the exception of the vernacular liturgy at this point, okay? But at the time, it was a great feeling to be a part of that opening up and that movement, and we were all dearly fond of John the 23rd, certainly, and that new sense, very much so.
Let's backtrack a little bit into your family life a little bit more, and brothers and sisters, and how you got along with everybody, and vis-a-vis also your sexuality or your unconscious musings or whatever. If you could chat about how when
Sure.
you thought, gee, I like him instead of her, and so on.
Right. I'm the third of five. All right, I have an older brother, an older sister than me, and two younger sisters. With the first three, including me, being very evenly spaced, a year and a half apart. Then you have a gap of 5 years, and then the other two spaced a year and a half apart. All right, which is, well, it's very interesting. Of course, you're talking about a Catholic family, which presumably doesn't use birth control, but I think most Catholic families, like everybody else, does, all right, even at that time. I mean, I don't know for sure what my parents were doing, but that's a curious spacing. Right.
I don't know what mine were doing
Right.
either.
It's a curious spacing. It had to be in some way planned. The one behind me had to be either an accident or a, I want another one because they're growing older, whatever the reason was, okay? Because you get the even spacing, you get the gap, and then even spacing again. So, yeah, so you can kind of assume that's playing out. My parents were not religious. They were a mixture of Italian descent and German descent. My father, the name Wandel, being of German descent, but my mother being of Italian descent. And in fact, closer to the Italian than to the German. My grandparents were Italian. On the other side, my great-grandparents were German. And that's where the Catholicism comes from. My father's parents were Lutheran. And it's interesting. We were always told that, that although we knew my paternal grandfather was Lutheran, we were always told that his wife, my grandmother, was Catholic, and that's why my father was Catholic. But after their death, going through papers, it appears like actually my father converted to Catholicism when he married my mother. Why would you not say that? I mean, it's interesting that has to somehow be a secret, you know.
Well, it seems like it has the effect of erasing another influence.
Yeah.
You know, and probably it sounds like with your particular family, maybe for the older generation, that was important because your parents were not particularly religious.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel like you became religious? I'm like psychoanalyzing. That's not.
That-
But how do you feel?
As long as you stick to a Jungian method, that's fine. Well, I think,
you became religious
yeah.
if the atmosphere wasn't religious.
well, certainly the Catholic school was. Also, in retrospect, certainly not conscious of it at the time, but in retrospect, there was one particular young priest at the parish who, after his death, he died young, and then, you know, you put out these funeral cards which had a picture of him. I carried that in my wallet for years. So what does that say? Again, very much on a subconscious level, but there was certainly an attraction there to the male grouping, to the idea of priesthood from very, very early on.
And it's, you know, I look around here and I bet there is something about the mystery of the church itself that took you in. I wonder.
Well, my view of religion is I am a Wiccan priest and have been for quite a few years, and I co-lead a Wiccan coven. So I tell people sometimes that I'm Wiccan or a witch, and they think that that's a radical change from my upbringing. But no, it's actually extremely consistent. So of course, Wicca does not think we don't believe there's any one true and only, so there's no sense of having to get somebody else to find this right for them. But I think, first of all, I don't think religion is right for everybody. I think for some people, including myself, it's an aid to spirituality. And for other people, fundamentalists of any kind, it is a blockage to spirituality. So I don't think that religion itself is right for everybody. But for those for whom it is correct, it is right for, well, then there are two factors involved, one of which is the degree of freedom to think, all right, and the other of which is ritual. So in my own case, somebody like the Unitarians, for example, are perfectly fine in terms of freedom to think or disagree or whatever, but from my point of view, they give lousy ritual, okay? I'm raised Catholic, all right? Wicca also can give good ritual. So Wicca is one that has both the freedom to think whatever you want to think, and again, it's not the one true religion, and also gives good ritual. So that is, it took me a while to get there. I'm not, to say the least. And I went through a period of trying out atheism, for example. I was briefly a member of the Gay Atheist League, or a chapter that they had here in New York City. But it's not right for me. That didn't work for me until I found Wicca. I had always been interested in mythology, and your average neo-pagan of any kind, Wicca is a subdivision of neo-pagan, are, compared to the population as a whole, very well versed cross-culturally in mythology.
You must have loved Joseph Campbell's series.
Joseph Campbell is I don't know a great deal about Campbell. I saw some of his series, which is many years ago now, and what little I know of him, he wasn't fully honest. I remember seeing he was talking about the hero myth, and he very definitely connected it to absolutely and necessarily being heterosexual. Okay, there are many myths. I mean, obviously there are many such myths which are heterosexual, but there are also many that are not, that are quite the opposite, and he must know that. He would have to have known that. I'm also told that, I don't know if this is true or not, he was very big on, and it's always one woman, one man. There was a strong, it's got to be monogamous element in that too. And I don't know if this is true or not, but from what I hear, he wasn't particularly monogamous. So there's a falseness in that.
I have to look into this. We won't get too far off track, but thank you for that. It reminded me of being on Steve Gaskin's Commune the Farm, and some of the symbiotic union being more important than, higher than man or woman. Okay.
Indeed, in most mythologies, there are deities and or heroes who just fuck anything that moves, right? So monogamy among the gods is, in pretty much any culture, is the exception, not the rule.
Let's go back to childhood and sexual awakening, though. When did you start noticing you were attracted to boys?
Not till much later. I mean, in retrospect, I can see a number of things. And indeed, when I was in high school, I did with my best friend do some fooling around. Once, twice maybe, and took a tell and just wouldn't do it. But we'd never thought of that as being homosexual or gay. We were just fooling around.
Were there words for that at the time that you remember other people using?
Well, I remember certainly, because I remember at the time, probably the very same year we were doing that was when Advice and Consent, the great film, came out, which is very much about homosexual blackmail and has a very terrible, terrible view. I mean, there's a gay bar scene which is just, I think it's Shelley Berman as a bartender being very fairy-like, which is okay if it's real, but it's not okay if that's all you show, right? And it's one of those, the guy's got to commit suicide because he's been discovered. I also remember, similarly, a few years later, The Detective with Frank Sinatra, which is also a very terrible view of homosexuality. It's a Trucks kind of thing, and murder and whatnot. So that was indeed around. Any sex was sinful if not married, so certainly that was also. But we didn't, neither my best friend nor I thought of ourselves that way. In the meantime, which I found out many, many, many years later, decades later, but his father was sexually attacked one of my sisters.
His father sexually
attacked one of my sisters. So suddenly, I was forbidden to see him anymore. Made no sense. We were not told why, and we weren't particularly fucking around, but we were best friends, and we met secretly. It made, and indeed, I remember going to confession. So I'm in high school now, and confessing about jerking off, which a few times we did together, my best friend and I. And the priest in confession told me I should not see him anymore. And a part of me knew that that was wrong, that somehow it made no sense to say that you should not. I mean, good friendship is a form of love, whether it's sexual or not, and it made no sense that this, supposedly follower of Jesus was attacking friendship. So I simultaneously, I still felt guilty. I still believed mortal sin, all of that, But at the same time, there were parts of me which was saying, no, there's something wrong here. There's something that doesn't add up.
It's very interesting because, lots of interviews and, of course, my own history and so on, how Catholicism in particular, because that's where I came from as well, hits. It's like on a spectrum. So the mortal sins thing with other folks, that just pulled them down and scared the living hell out of them. It sounds like you had a place internally where you're able to say, this doesn't all make sense, so you weren't completely wrapped up in that. Right. I wonder if I don't know, Vatican II had anything to do with that, or your parents?
No, I don't think so. I think it was just instinct, frankly. I mean, I still was all during this period very much planning on going into the seminary, okay, which again, I think part of the subconscious motivation was the false belief that that's the way to avoid the question because of the celibacy priesthood. And in fact, once I entered as a freshman in college, once I entered the seminary, I stopped jerking off for a good number of years. Eventually it came back again, maybe 4 or 5 years after that. Well, by the time that happened, and I went and spoke to my spiritual director about it, by that time there was a little bit of a shift. It wasn't so much a mortal sin. They're still sick, you understand, but it wasn't so much a mortal sin as a sign of there being some psychological problem,
So forgiveness is there, potentially.
Well, it didn't even come up. It was more like you're having a problem, and you wouldn't be jerking off if you weren't having a problem. All right? Not that the jerking off was a problem, but that it was a symptom of some other psychological problem. And so indeed they sent me to a shrink for a short while. Very Catholic shrink. I was in Jamaica, Queens by that time, at the monastery there.
What year was that?
It had to be 68, 69, around there somewhere. Right.
I lived in Queens Village until 64.
Right. It had to be around there. So it was changing within the church, but I was still essentially avoiding it. Now, the order I was in after novitiate, which came after, you had 2 years of college, then you had a year of novitiate, and then you continued on with the college, majoring. We didn't call it that, but it was effectively a double major of philosophy and history, all done within house, okay, at that point in time. And then after novitiate, you took temporary vows for 3 years. Then you have those 2 more years of college and the first year of what they call theology, where it's graduate work with the major being theology, which at that point we were doing at St. John's University, living in Union City, New Jersey, going to school at St. John's University, which of course is in Queens, New York. Where was I going with this? I have no idea. All right, so at the end of that 3 years, it's time for renewing your vows, taking permanent vows. And they said, no, you can't do that. All right. They never tell you why. People would disappear literally overnight, and you'd never know why, whether they decided to leave, whether they were thrown out, or what their reasons of the orders, you would never know. So they decided they were not going to let me take final vows. And I talked them into allowing me to renew temporary vows for a year while I figured out what was going on. I went down that summer to Philadelphia. A bunch of us were renting a house, and we were going to get quote-unquote real jobs and see what the world was like or something. I was down there for a month, and then I quit. You cannot fire me, I quit, kind kind of thing. Now,
What was the convincing factor there for you?
well, other things were happening too. The year before that, again, it's amazing how clear things can be in retrospect. All right. The year before that, the summer before that, I had gone down to Catholic University to study church history at Catholic University. So this is what, 68 or thereabouts, and 68, yeah, something like that, 69, whatever. And at the same time, you have the anti-war movement. At Catholic University, you have Daniel Berrigan. All right, the influences of the Second Vatican Council are spreading further and further. And he, of course, is getting in trouble, not only for his peace work, all right, which he's most known for, got to jail for it, as a matter of fact, but also he's talking about female clergy, he's talking about a number of things that upset not only Rome, but the local bishops. So that's the atmosphere. And I was staying in a dorm with, I think, 2 other older seminarians from the order, okay? And I woke up one night and jerking off like crazy, saying, but I'm a man, I'm a man, I'm a man. I never said, God, these 2 guys I'm living with are gorgeous, all right? I never said that, but that's, in retrospect, that's what was happening. That kind of stimulation was happening. And then when I went down the year later, I went down to Philadelphia. I still remember a really amazing dream where I woke up and in conjunction with my best friend in the order, who was also in Philadelphia, going down into the basement and opening up a trunk which was filled with male porno. I still didn't quite put it together, okay? So it was bubbling up. It was bubbling up, but I didn't quite put it together. So after I quit, I came back, lived briefly for a month or so with my parents on Long Island, and then moved into the city. Had a job at a photo studio. And the first thing that happened with that was I was sharing an apartment off at Times Square, just a kind of a 1-room apartment with another person. And I half wake up one night, you know, wake up but not obviously woken up, and he's stroking my leg. So I handled that by slowly awakening, never confronting it, you know, giving him time to back off, and then moved out within a week or so. And went to another place. But I'm meeting more and more gay people because I'm in the theater district, all right? And a friend of mine, for example, from high school, a neighborhood friend, heterosexual friend, but nevertheless, he's a singer. I'm starting to get surrounded by that whole world. And then I go over for Holy Week services to the last monastery I was in Union City, New Jersey. And while I'm over there, I run into a young man who I knew before, all right? I'm probably conflating things here to a certain extent, but taking it as a true myth, so to speak, it'll be accurate. And we wind up both staying in the monastery overnight together, having sex, simply frottage, because neither of us knew what the hell we were doing, frankly, all right? Well, this sent me briefly into a strong tailspin, you know, but not for long.
What happened? What was that like?
It was like, I remember immediately after that getting extremely drunk, you know, and I have a vague memory. At this point, I was living on, I was subletting an apartment for 3 months, from somebody who would go to, I think it was Florida every year, and he was older than I am, and his sexuality was all sorts of truck drivers who passed through town knew to ring his doorbell to get a blowjob. All right, so I was staying at Peter's place, and with the doorbell ringing from time to time, and my simply saying, Peter's not here, he'll be back in 2 months or whatever it was. All right, but I remember getting very, very drunk and literally crawling up the stairs to the whatever it was, 2nd or 3rd floor that the apartment was on. But I already had friends who were either gay themselves or were, you know, or were in a world that included those people, including the person I was subletting from, Peter. So I already, without necessarily thinking it out logically, but I was already at the point where I wasn't judging somebody else because they were gay. So I actually got through that fairly quick. And so in retrospect, it's like for years, I was 24 already, all right? So for years, it's bubbling up totally unconsciously. And then, you know, to an outside observer, it seems like it happened all of a sudden, but in fact, of course, it's in an unconscious way been bubbling up for years. Right around the same time, I happened to run into the Gay Activists Alliance at some demonstration. I was passing through, all right?
Do you remember anything about that demonstration?
I think I'm conflating a couple, all right, together. But we're talking about Times Square. And I'm pretty sure I'm conflating something in March along with something that happened later on in that same year. And not uncommonly in the summertime, mayors would clean up Times Square. And so they would arrest anybody who they thought looked gay, all right? And
with what charge?
I don't know offhand. Probably soliciting. Soliciting is still illegal, right? That was thrown out many years later by the courts in New York, not by the legislature. So I ran into them and I started going to their meetings. So I literally came out into gay liberation in, say, the spring of 1970, right? And Gay Activists Alliance being founded in December of 1969, and of course GLF a few months earlier in 1969, in probably July, I would think, 1969. So on one of these occasions, and I think it was a little bit later in that same year, I'm again walking through Times Square because I was still seeing people in Union City, New Jersey, either at the monastery or people I knew in the neighborhood, because when you're in the seminary, you are a god to local Catholic families, so you have friends, right? And so my way home would be a bus to Port Authority, walk through Times Square over to 6th Avenue where I'd catch the D train, which would take me to Flatbush, which is where I was living at the time. So I think I knew ahead of time that there was going to be a demonstration, but I wasn't planning on going, still being nervous. So I'm coming home from whoever I was seeing in Union City, New Jersey, and the demonstration, which was a joint demonstration of Gay Liberation Front, GLF, and Gay Activists Alliance, GAA, we're doing, at that point, a simple picket back and forth in Times Square. After a while, by whatever method things get decided, I certainly wouldn't know what that was at the time, the decision was made to go down to the local precinct that was doing it all, which I think was down in the 30s on the west side. So we did that. And then after doing the back and forth kind of picketing there, it was decided to walk down to the village. So we get down to 6th Avenue and 8th Street. Now, at the time, you still have the Women's House of Detention and what is now the community garden there. So GAA officially folded their banner at this point. GAA was a one-issue organization. We can talk about that later and what that means.
I do want to talk about the difference between
yeah,
the GAA
right.
and the GLF.
Right. So for a while, and of course, folding the banner doesn't mean we all went home. It means we were no longer officially GAA, right? But we were certainly all staying there. And so we were circling the Women's House of Detention, like Joshua at Jericho for a while. And I remember some of the women were lighting slips of paper or whatever and throwing them out just as a way of, hi, how are you, kind of communication with the crowd. And at the time, on that evening, 8th Street from 6th Avenue probably to 5th was closed off as a pedestrian mall until midnight. So we're all then in that area, 8th Street between 6th Avenue and 5th. And you know, there are several streets in between 6th Avenue and 5th at that point, right? And we're dancing in the street, we're having a good time. Midnight comes. Midnight, the street is supposed to open up again to traffic. Well, we weren't planning on going anywhere, right? we're still having a good time. So the police cars come, and the police want to make us move, open up the street. And I noticed two things, all right? I noticed that there certainly were provocateurs in the crowd who would throw stuff over the crowd at the police. But also I noticed that the police would just pick the shortest or smallest person around and beat the shit out of them in response to that, okay? So I was simultaneously frightened, but couldn't leave the place until finally in the process, and I was not at the front of the crowd, I was back, all right? I was wearing sandals and one broke, then I had to go home. So I did at that point. But the way I often phrase it, and here's where the word myth perhaps comes properly in, but myth being a certain kind of truth nevertheless, all right? It's I saw blood on the streets and identified immediately with that as my community. And from that time on, I was not only going to GAA meetings and afterwards to other such things, but I was very much a part of it all and working at it all.
I want to,
We just switch media real quick.
I'd like to go back just a little bit, even though 1970, 71 certainly political consciousness is, ripe. But bringing it back a few years into the 60s, late 60s, your sense of the civil rights movement, your sense of the anti-war movement, what your feelings about those were, how they may have informed or influenced you along with the religious aspect, and so I'll let you, and the counterculture, the counterculture.
Sure. Well, of course, my high school years are at a time when the civil rights movement is on TV all the time, is in the news. And when I say in the news, I mean video or film, whatever they were using in those days. I mean film of Southern police using hoses to just knock the hell out of fire hoses. That's not a light thing, all right? Knocking down crowds, the integration of the schools, the George Wallace, you shall not pass here, all of that. In the North at that time, or at least in my family at that time, there was a veneer of acceptance of all people. But it was a veneer. I know since then, it's very much a veneer. At that time, somebody like me would have believed, erroneously, that segregation and prejudice, race prejudice, was largely a problem of the South and not of the North, all right? Because the North, including New York, Long Island, wherever, was much more subtle about it. I mean, it did pop into the papers with things like the anti-busing crusades in Boston and whatever. But the general feeling was that's those terrible people down there, we're not like that, okay? But then, of course, into this, you get the 1968 Democratic Convention, okay? So at this point, I'm in college at this point, all right? But you see the police riot, and you know and identify it as a police riot, certainly in the group of people that I was with. That's a very, that and the Kennedy assassination certainly is a very identifying moments for my generation. When I came out of a family of conservative Republican, not the way conservative Republican means today, or by any means, but nevertheless, still conservative Republican, Goldwater Republicans specifically. And so on entering college, entering the seminary, that's, as is common, you come with your parents' beliefs, and it takes time for those to develop into whatever way they're going to develop. So indeed, in my first year in the seminary, we had a local presidential debate, and I was on the Goldwater side, okay? But again, the seminary experience itself changed that over time. A couple of years into it, a number of years after that, for example, in Hartford, for some summer courses, still in seminary, we did tutoring in a poor area of Hartford. And the people we were tutoring were largely Hispanic. But you couldn't help but notice we were tutoring in terms of reading. Well, we had 8th graders who did not know the alphabet. Now, clearly to me, and it was clear to me at the time, that nobody could get to the 8th grade without knowing even the alphabet unless the system really didn't give a damn about them. How could that possibly happen to just be push forward, all right? So it was clear to me, certainly by then, that what we were talking about, you know, not these ignorant, in this case, Latins, but we were talking about a system that was prejudiced and didn't give a damn about them. Later on, a couple of years after that, you had the whole Biafra thing, which I was certainly a part of. Again, not in any leadership way, but I was in the crowds. And then, of course, the Vietnam War. Now, I left the seminary, was thrown out, left the seminary in 1969. And so that instantly brought up the question of the draft, okay? Because up to then I had been deferred as being in college and or being a religious. So my first thought was to apply for conscientious objector on the grounds of longstanding Catholic theology about the definition of a just war, okay? And on those grounds, I applied for CO status. Now, under the law, that I knew, even as I applied for it, that would not work. Under the law, you can only be a CO if you're opposed to all war at all times. They do not allow you to be opposed on moral grounds to this particular war.
If you could just say CO stands for?
CO stands for conscientious objector. So if you were, and you really had to be in a religion or something that said that, such as the Society of Friends, the Quakers, or one of those. But I applied anyway, using Catholic theology on what is or is not a just war. While this was going through, while the papers were in and I'm waiting to hear, they changed it so that they began doing what they called pre-induction physicals. Formerly, you would get drafted, then you'd go to the Army physical, and then either be accepted or not into the Army. They changed that to being, going to a physical prior to actually being drafted. That way they could eliminate the people who would not get in for those reasons. Well, by the time that came along, I was living in New York. I was already a member of the Gay Activist Alliance, and I was actually the news editor for a gay newspaper. Gay being actually the title of the newspaper at the time, for gay newspaper here in New York. So I in effect had proof of being homosexual, and that was still the grounds for not being into the going into the Army. The way they did it at that time, everybody's familiar with medical forms that, you know, have you ever had diabetes? Do you have allergies? Do you have whatever? And that long list of things, and down at the bottom of it, with a place to put a check mark, was homosexual tendencies. So as we phrased it in those days, I checked the box. And it was, that in itself was a very interesting experience. I'm of course older than most of the people in the physical because of the years of deferment, right? Most of them are, I guess, 18 or 19 or something like that. And it was interesting, of course, we're all still civilians. We're not even drafted yet. We're all still civilians. But the majority, but the people running the you know, get in line here, do this, do that, treated you as if you were already in the Army. And the vast majority of people, up to the point even of saying, yes, sir, reacted as if that were true. I, on the other hand, knew that was not true. I did everything required of me. I did not make a protest out of it. But I did not snap to attention at all. I was very well aware that I was not in the Army and had no intention of doing so. So we had to see a shrink. The shrink was not there that day. I had to come back another day. And I had met somebody the first time around from Long Island who was also checking the box. And we both then had to come back the same day to see the shrink. which we did, and hooked up and went back to my place and had a grand old afternoon afterwards.
What was the shrink experience, though? What was he asking?
I don't remember it too much. It was very quick. It was very, very quick. And as I say, I was already, on the masthead of gay newspaper. I'm not sure if that actually came up, but and I went in with lambdas blazing. I mean, the lambda was the gay lib emblem of the time, right? And I had this I guess it must have been wintertime. I had this wonderful knitted blue and gold scarf with a giant lambda on it. I mean, I was flaming, not so much in the sense of so-called femininity, but yeah, I was flaming through it. So there was not much difficulty there.
It's 1970. If we could go back to 1969, did you have a sense of what was happening with Stonewall? What happened to those events?
Right. I left. It was 1969 when I was that summer in Philadelphia. So I would have come back to New York approximately August or September. In other words, after Stonewall, and which got very little coverage. I was not a reader of the Village Voice or of any of the underground newspapers, which is, I mean, I think there was some coverage in the Daily News too, but I wasn't reading any of those papers. So I was not at all aware of Stonewall until the following spring, actually, as soon as I connected with other gays and Gay Activists Alliance, very quickly I knew about Stonewall, but not prior to that.
Did it feel when you started becoming part of Gay Activists Alliance in the spring of '70 that those activities were connected to what had happened the summer before, or did it?
Well, I mean, I knew that the founding of, well, I knew, of course, that there were older organizations, the Mattachine Society, Daughters of Bilitis, but I also knew that there was a great push forward as in the aftermath of the Stonewall riots. I'm not quite going to say because of the Stonewall riots. That is a cause, but not the only cause. What do I mean by that? I mean, first of all, there had to be a foundation there, and there certainly was a foundation there in the earlier work of people like Harry Hay on the West Coast, or Frank Kameny, and at the time of Stonewall, Dick Leitch here on the East Coast, and Barbara Giddings, et cetera, all right? And after Stonewall, immediately after Stonewall, what guaranteed that it didn't just end there were people like Craig Rodwell, who immediately seized upon it, began to organize and make noise about it. Now, at the time of Stonewall, there was already a Mattachine Action Committee, all right? A subdivision of Mattachine. It was not a good fix. It was not a good fit. It was people like Marty Robinson and probably, I'm losing her name, it'll come to me eventually, and a handful of people who wanted to, out of Mattachine, do more active things. And so that was already there, okay? And that had to be there already in order to take advantage of what happened after Stonewall. Stonewall is not the first gay riot, not by a number of years, not by a few years, nor is it first demonstrations by rather a few years. So all of that is important.
Yet it becomes even though there were the Compton riots in San Francisco, the Tenderloin, this becomes the iconic moment. Maybe the same way Woodstock becomes the iconic moment for the counterculture, even though there were many pop festivals that summer.
Well, more than that, it's because people were there, notably Craig and Marty Robinson and the founders of GLF. There were people there to not let it just disappear. And Martha Shelley is the other name. I was temporarily lost.
August 15th, I'm going to Portland, Oregon.
Excellent.
Interviewing her.
Good.
Could you talk about the Gay Activists Alliance, GAA, and where they were coming from versus the Gay Liberation Front?
Right. Of course, GLF, Gay Liberation Front, comes first. And indeed, all of the founders of the Gay Activists Alliance were members first of the Gay Liberation Front. All right. The Gay Liberation Front, I was not a member of the Gay Liberation Front, but from what I know of it, GLF was very consciously a left organization, and very consciously, therefore, in support of a variety of left causes, notably the Black Panthers, who they helped raise money for, and were very, very consciously so. I think perhaps even more importantly, there was an idea among the left at the time about consciousness raising, about a lack of leadership, all right? And so you didn't have elected officials, you didn't have rules to follow in a discussion or whatever. And by this time, some of the women were beginning to say, you say we're doing this to be more democratic, but actually it's the opposite. Because for a variety of both biological and cultural reasons, men's voices carry further. Men are more likely to be trained, consciously or otherwise, to open their mouths. And women are more likely to be trained to shut up when a man talks. So that indeed, it was not democratic at all. It was the loudest voice wins. Some of the members of the Gay Liberation Front, notably Arthur Evans, Marty Robinson, Jim Owls, took a look at this. They were part of the organization, and they said this is not working, okay? That this can only work if two things happen. There must be a real structure, and we must be one issue. Gay liberation only. Which I believe at that time, but not now, was the right way to go. It was the only way to build a gay movement at that time. It would be wrong to do that now, but I believe it was right at that time. An example of this, and there were certainly differences between the men and the women at the time. And now I'm not talking about things I was at, but things I've learned about at this stage, okay? The Black Panther Party held a People's Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The left, with few exceptions, were as bad as the right wing in terms of homosexuality, Huey Newton being a notable exception, all right? But pretty much were as terrible as anybody else. So both GLF men and GLF women went down as part of this convention in Philadelphia and were treated horribly, absolutely horribly. The women walked out in protest. The men stayed. There was a real need, I think, at the time among these people to be accepted by the left. That was, that was most important to them. What do I think about that? First of all, I don't say this to put down GLF, quite the opposite. GLF was an absolutely necessary stage along the way, right? All of us to this day have a certain amount of internalized homophobia. Obviously at that time, it was, at least if you're a New Yorker or San Francisco or Chicago, much stronger than it is for us today, okay? So that idea of being, and they identified first as being of the left. And so that became very important to them. And I think in that context of the time, to the detriment of gay liberation, all right? However, it had to start that way, all right? And I discovered later, because I did an organizing trip through the Midwest with a couple of other people a year or two after that. And there were a couple of cities that we went where something already existed and we made contact. But the places that we went to that did not already have something existing, something would start as a result of our being there, usually collapse within a year, and be replaced by something that was lasting. So it seems to be a natural development in a given area to start that way, to fall apart, and to have something come out of it which is more lasting.
Why do you think the Gay Liberation Front was the way to start? What was it about the Gay Liberation Front that resonated with the time that it would have to happen that way in order to...
Their heyday was only a year, all right? And it fell apart by reason of their not being structured in a way. I mean, in Gay Activist Alliance, they also insisted on structure. So they used Robert's Rules of Order, okay? And you just smile and joke like that. But and a GLF person would have looked upon Robert's Rules of Order as being anti-democratic. But the reality of Robert's Rules is if only a few people know the rules, it's anti-democratic. But if everybody knows them, it is extremely democratic, okay? And so in order to become a voting member of the Gay Activist Alliance, you had to go to an orientation session. There were several things you had to do. You had to go to a certain number of regular meetings. You had to visit at least a couple of committees and see what they were doing. But you also had to go to this orientation session. And the orientation session was primarily learning Robert's Rules of Order. So there was an understanding that you needed structure, but that everybody had to know that structure to be truly democratic. And they were.
Now, I smiled because the Robert's Rules of Order was the what we used when in the late '70s. I was part of one of those alternative community high schools, and that was what we used for our meetings. So Gay Activist Alliance decides that we have to keep our eyes on the prize, and that's gay liberation,
Right.
not necessarily thinking about our relationship to the rest of the left, not to the
Right.
war, not to Black Panthers, not to the women's liberation movement, not to any of it.
Exactly.
That's the eyes on the prize. And you felt at the time that that was the right way to go.
I still feel that at that time it was the right way to go.
Okay, gotcha. Could you speak a little bit more about the sort of the larger universality of the gay liberation front?
Sure. Well, I question whether that's really true. I mean, yes, that is there to this day. A couple of people who are still we're good, you're bad, and there are a few GAA people like that. There are a few GLF people like that. They still may see it that way. Arthur Dong's documentary of a number of years ago, which clearly was made to fit his agenda despite what you said to him, is an example of that's quite a few years ago.
What's the name
Arthur
of it?
Dong is the name of the filmmaker. I don't remember anymore what the name of the film is,
Okay.
the documentary film is. I'm in it, as are a number of other people. And so I know how what was said was manipulated, right? Which is why I can say that. It was necessary, if you went to a GAA meeting, all right, if you took a look at the leadership, you would see people very much on the left, okay? Very much, even progressive is probably too mild a term for some of them. Arthur Evans, who was par excellence the ideological basis of GAA, was admittedly and openly a socialist. And of course, you're still talking about a time in American history where just saying that word means you're written off, right? So that's clear, all right? In the large meeting, okay, certainly the majority would be somewhere along the liberal line. But it also included a handful of out-and-out misogynists, for example. You know, it included very few blacks. It reflected, certainly we were coming out of, initially, out of very much a white middle class. That's what it was. That's how it got started, all right? Because segregation, including in the North, was, and probably still is, very, very real, okay? So you certainly had this left-leaning leadership, by which I mean the elected offices and the committee chairs, but you were able to bring under your umbrella a vast number of people who would have been scared off by that. And I think that's what had to be at the time. You see it similarly in other ways. I think any group has to first get themselves together, all right? An example certainly would be lesbians also. Lesbians, certainly a minority, were a part of Gay Activists Alliance as they were a part of GLF. Well, GLF was an umbrella term, so they could pretend everybody was still together. But in fact, you had different cells which were very separate. The radical lesbians were certainly very separate from what the men were doing. Why? As in GAA, the Lesbian Feminist Liberation, originally a committee in GAA and then a separate organization, was also doing very separate things. It had to be. Just as gays had to get together among themselves, lesbians had to get together among themselves before it would ever be really possible to come and truly work together. And I think that remains true. Today, the rising group, hopefully, are transgender. And of course, they have their own organizations. It is certainly right and good and necessary in the modern time that they are also part of the umbrella, say at the community center or other such places. But they need their own organizations. They need to concentrate on what their issues are, and indeed to get past whatever internalized transphobia they may have within themselves. You know, and it's got to work that way. So you have to start by that pulling back and being away. Right.
So interesting. So if you're looking at the Gay Activists Alliance at that point, because it becomes a single issue, it's open to people all along the spectrum, but still the majority of people and probably the leadership, their sentiments probably would have been anti-war.
Yeah, we would meet each other.
Rights.
Yeah, sure. We would all be down in Washington for the anti-war moratoriums, you know, but not under a gay banner, but not under a GAA banner.
Very interesting. Very strategic.
Right. Sure.
Very strategic. In some ways, it almost makes me think that a straight arrow from Gay Activists Alliance ends up bringing us same-sex equality 30 some odd years later.
Indeed, if you trace organizations and who founded them, you will, in almost all cases, find that the new organization is being founded by people who were in the former one. That's certainly true of GLF to GAA, but it's also true of GAA to the Lavender Hill Mob. It's true of the Lavender Hill Mob to ACT UP, all right? And I'm only talking about New York, but I'm absolutely certain it would be true elsewhere in the country as well. You know. And even from Mattachine to GLF, in the sense that Marty Robinson and Martha Shelley, I think Martha Shelley was also part of the Mattachine Action Committee.
It's interesting because I interviewed Ellen Broidy about 2 months ago, who was in Gay Liberation Front, and she said at the time she would see, you know, Barbara Giddings and them doing, you know, they had to wear stockings, the men had to wear suits, and they'd march around the front of the, I guess, the White House,
Independence Hall or the White House, or indeed the draft board also in Whitehall Street.
For homosexual rights.
Right.
And at the time she looked at it as, oh my God, these people are looking for acceptance, you know, that's just like, that's not where we're at all. And of course, very much like the Black Panthers looked at the earlier civil rights movement, you know, come on, we're not looking for acceptance, we're looking for revolution.
Right. But it was always a mixture. Certainly it's true that the Mattachine membership was looking, they would, in their discussion groups, West Side Discussion Group is an offshoot of the Mattachine Society, they would bring in psychiatrists, for example, and indeed among the membership, you would certainly see a lot of, we know we're sick, but you shouldn't pick on us, all right? But that's certainly not true of Frank Kameny. Certainly never was true of Harry Hay. So again, you have the difference between the leadership, you know, and the rank and file. And I don't think it would have been true of Barbara Giddings either.
Well, it was interesting because Ellen Broidy, you know, in the interview said, now I look back at them at that time in history and saying, oh my God, how brave they were.
Oh my God, yes.
And really the recognition of standing on the shoulders
Absolutely.
of those who came before.
Absolutely.
Which the millennials are all going to have to do one time too.
You know, well, yeah, we have to do it continually. I mean, clearly our current political situation is in spades shows you why it's not over, whether you're talking about LGBT or any of a host of other things. But yeah.
I'd like to get your impression.
I mean, you take Dick Leitch just died a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
All right, and I was so happy to see the wonderful turnout at his funeral at Smoky Mary's. Smoky Mary's that's a nickname of an Episcopal church in Manhattan because they use lots of incense. It's aptly named. But if I, and I don't think this is true of many people today, but once upon a time, and there's maybe a need when you're starting new to make these false divisions too. I don't know, but the thought that he was, too conservative, that he tried to calm people after Stonewall, etc. But if I look back at that, and when Dick Leitch was president of the Mattachine Society, which of course is late in the Mattachine's history, not early, right, up to and including 1969, who did he have around him to support him? A handful of people, all right? When I was president of GA, I had a meeting full of 400 people, all right? Much more, and much more difficult, I would think, for at Dick Leitch's time, much braver of Dick Leitch or Frank Kameny or Harry Hay to do that than it was by the time that I came along.
Could you talk a little bit about being the president of GAA?
Mm-hmm. I got involved very quickly in GAA. As I think I mentioned before, one of the requirements for becoming a voting member was go to a certain number of committee meetings. GAA worked on a committee structure. Ultimately, actions or whatever had to be approved by the whole floor on a Thursday night, but working about what we should do, et cetera, and planning this, that, or the other thing was done in a variety of committees. Some of them ongoing committees, such as the municipal committee dealing with the city council, and some of them were ad hoc committees. So I went to an ad hoc committee on the Dick Cavett Show. The Dick Cavett Show at the time was the intellectual late night show, all right, competing with I guess probably Jack Parr at that point, or whomever, the 11 o'clock show, or 11:30, whatever. And he had a guest, I don't remember who. He had a guest who was saying terrible things about gays. So in a response to this, first of all, GAA always started with letters of protest. Not because we thought they would work, but because the standard argument against you if you did something was, well, you should have just talked to us. So we always did first. We said, yeah, right, we did that, okay? You always had to do that first for that reason, not for an expectation that it had any chance of working. So it was decided through this ad hoc committee. Well, so I went to this ad hoc committee, and which was chaired by Marty Robinson. Marty Robinson was very important to me personally because he knew how to get you involved. Marty, a famous quote for me anyway from Marty is that the best, the cure for guilt, the best cure for guilt is anger. I don't know if I believe that fully, but he's got a damn good point, at least in the context of that time. All right. So I go to this committee meeting, and he gives me a job to do. Now, in retrospect, it was a job which, if I totally fucked up, still would have gotten done. Somebody else was also working on it. But Marty knew how to pull you in. And then everybody went, and Marty and I screwed. I talk a lot, actually, about the number of sexual relationships in the Gay Activists Alliance. Occasionally they blew up terribly, as in Arthur Evans, Arthur Bell. But for the most part, I think it was a very real part of the glue. We knew that that's what we were talking about, the freedom to be sexual. And most of us were non-monogamous. There were certainly a number of monogamous couples. But most of us were non-monogamous and fucking around with each other all over the place. And I think that's an important part of what we were doing, you know?
You're just bringing back a memory I haven't thought of in years. In the mid-late 80s, in the period of time when I was, even through the HIV crisis at its worst, there was a lot of sexual interaction. And I remember at one point feeling like, this is my tribe.
Mm-hmm.
There was a tribal aspect to it, and it felt very important. There was another aspect that made me wonder, why I was doing all of this, but there was a very firm
Mhm.
feeling that this is my tribe, and this is important, and we're pulling each other together, we're interacting. It may be around sexual experience and orgasms, but there's something else there. Anyway.
Right.
I'm running away with this, sorry.
You also, I mean, a couple of GLF people like to see themselves as the radicals, and GAA as being bourgeois even, or very conservative even. It's not true. It's not true because even by today's standards, in many ways we were quite radical, and certainly by the standards of that day. It was radical, really radical, to build an organization that was fully democratic, for example. I mean, GLF also was attempting that, but I don't think it worked with them, all right? When we decided that the statement written by Arthur Evans and approved, as always, everything was by the floor of the Gay Activist Alliance, what is referred to as the preamble to the GAA Constitution, is perhaps the first time that doesn't say we're suing for our rights, we demand our rights. It says we have these rights, period, no argument, all right? That certainly was a radical thing to do at the time, all right? When we were putting demands together for, I don't know, maybe it was for a march on Albany, whatever it was, what our demands were, or maybe it was the general demands of the organization, and in terms of sodomy laws, the question came up, are we fighting for the rights of consenting adults or for the rights of consenting persons? Okay? Those pushing mostly for the consenting persons were the people who were under 21. It was the young people pushing for this more than anything else. And the vote went back and forth a couple of times, and certainly GAA did not put on a big banner somewhere what we were doing. But the decision was we were fighting for the sexual rights of consenting persons. All right? That is still radical, very radical.
Probably even these days a little more problematic.
Indeed, because it would be noticed immediately.
It would be noticed immediately.
Right.
Could you speak about some of the events or zaps that?
Oh, they were so much fun. The zaps, the GAA zaps were, they were empowering in themselves, all right? When we started, and GLF started, it was the belief of politicians that we were only a small group, not even throughout Manhattan, just in the village. And when we submitted a bill in City Council, a civil rights bill in City Council, the thought was, the response often was, but you have all your rights. There's no discrimination. So the trick became to highlight the discrimination. What I'm talking about now actually is the surface level of what we were doing, okay? So we would choose whether politicians or organizations that were discriminating in housing and public accommodations in employment, and or politicians. But what we were really doing, and very consciously about this, we were certainly aware that no legislation, even if it passed immediately, which it certainly wasn't going to, all right, would give us our rights, any more than the various civil rights law based at that time on race, and now also in terms of women, mean that there's no discrimination, racial or sexual discrimination. Of course there is, all right? But you needed a hook to bring this to the fore. And a piece of legislation, which two people in City Council were willing to put forward, Eldon Klingon and Carter Burden in city council. But that really was the hook. There was certainly no thought that this would pass. So much so that, for example, when some politicians pretended they'd go for it if we if we did not include teachers or firemen or what today we would call transgenders, all right? We said, no, we won't do that. We held our ground. We held our ground both because it was right, but also because we knew the legislation itself was not what would change the world. You know, it was more the battle for it and the bringing it in view of the public that would change the world. And we did that, and the primary thing that would change in society would be people coming out. The most important thing was people coming out. So we would, early on perhaps only in the village area, but expanding through the years elsewhere, we would walk hand in hand, kiss goodbye at the subway. Somebody we hardly knew. We knew it, we were doing it specifically as a political act. And that's what we were doing, all right? In the same way some people would do what we refer to as gender fuck, a guy with a beard wearing a dress kind of thing. And that's what we were doing. And of course, when you do a demonstration, you got to get the media. The idea, indeed, what you're aiming at is the media, not just the people who happen to be walking by on that particular day. So we would certainly highlight discriminators, but it was about that media. So we would get very clever. We would get theatrical at times. You have to have a hook. You have to have a gimmick. I misquoted that. You have to have a gimmick. And so we did, on occasion, things like Marty Robinson in a duck costume at HFC, was it HFC? No, at Fidelifax. Fidelifax was an employment agency. And the owner, and as always, you start with letters and you start with trying to talk to them, and that builds up and doesn't work, and then you're able to do the demonstration. So the president of Fidelifax, when asked, because they would mark employment applications with HFC, meaning HCF, high class ferry. Arthur Evans knew this because he used to work for an employment agency, all right? And so that was why we were attacking them. And so he was asked, well, how do you know that a person is gay? And his response was, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it is a duck. Thus, the duck costume, all right? So we would use things like that to help, of course, get the media. The primary way to get the media was arrests. And that's true whether it was our struggle or anybody else's. So you would often you'd do sit-ins resulting in arrests. And there was somewhat of an unwritten law about how that works with the police department. We tended to attack, certainly in terms of politicians, more liberal ones, because at that time, if you attacked the conservative, you would just increase their support, right? The liberal had to look liberal, all right? So the last thing a liberal politician, or the last thing a company wanting to look good to the public, the last thing they wanted was to get in the paper. And arrest will do that. So typically, they wouldn't do it. You do a sit-in, they would do nothing until eventually it's 5 o'clock or whatever time, that people got to go home. All right, then they have to do something. And the unwritten law in New York City, not necessarily elsewhere, the unwritten law was the police would say to you 3 times, leave or be arrested.
I looked at that kid in the 60s, I would go and I'd slap him now, his liberal democratic politics, Trump is an anti-gay, and going on and on and on and on. But, okay.
We're only sorry about that.
So people would be leaving at 5 o'clock and...
So what would happen in this case is because they didn't, they would try to, an organization or politician would avoid arresting people because they didn't want the PR. But eventually 5 o'clock or whatever would come when it's time to close the office. It has to be done. And there was kind of an unwritten rule with the police department that you would be warned 3 times, leave or be arrested. And so typically you would wait for that third time, you know, and when it was said the third time, then everyone would leave except those that we had pre-agreed would stay and be arrested. And that was based obviously on their volunteering, but also on how many can we have arrested, how many we can afford for the legal costs that will come afterwards. And so, I mean, my favorite is I have some favorites, of course, is we did a whole solid week in June, in Pride Week. I'm terrible at dates, probably 70, but maybe not. Anyway, John Lindsay is running for president. All right, it's early on in the interminable process of running for president, but he's running for president. He's a liberal mayor of New York, a guy we hounded mercilessly, but then all went and voted for when it came November. But anyway, so we were attacking him at City Hall all week. And then at the end of that week, he was about to do a fundraiser, a presidential fundraiser, at Radio City Music Hall. We were a bit fearful. We had heard that the City Hall cops would also be up at Radio City Music Hall, and we were afraid, therefore, of being recognized. And for that reason, we went in disguise, a bunch of us. I was normally clean-shaven at that time, but I had this wonderful Abraham Lincoln beard that they set up for me. We had a number of tickets for the event, which we got by people giving them to us. So we had, I think, 5 people who had orchestra seats at Radio City Music Hall. And we gave each of these 5 people something that was popular at the time, although I don't know why. It was this siren, the handheld siren where you would pull a pin and the siren would go off, presumably to stop a mugging or something is how they were being marketed, all right? So we had 5 of us there. And first onto the stage comes Alan King, a well-known comedian, liberal comedian at the time, and supporter of John Lindsay. And he was going to introduce the mayor. And he came and he did a bit and then introduced John Lindsay. John Lindsay comes out on stage, and not all 5, but one person stands up and starts yelling at him something to the effect of, what are you going to do about the oppression of homosexuals in New York City, you know? And John thinks he can handle it. And of course, meanwhile, people, security guards, whoever they are rushing to grab. Was Cora Parada was the first person to grab her out. So they obviously grab her out. Just before they grab her, she pulls the pin on that siren, throws the pin in one direction under the seats and the siren in another direction under the seats. They pull her out. John Lindsay comes back to the microphone, and the second person stands up and starts, and so on through the 5 people. In addition to that, we had a bunch of people outside doing a picket line. At that time, there were a number of conservative anti-Lindsay groups, including the Jewish Defense League, which was obviously Jewish, but a very conservative, a right-wing Jewish group. Certainly not people that we would particularly like, but we already had a reputation of being really good at disruption. And so they came to us and gave us a whole bunch of tickets that they had to the balcony. So at the same time we were shouting downstairs, we had a couple of people in the balcony with leaflets who just kind of threw them over the balcony. We hounded him somewhat unmercifully, again, because it was important to us. John Lindsay had already, going back to the Mattachine Society, has already quietly done certain things to improve the reaction of the city, and specifically the police department, to the gay community. But we were smart enough to know it didn't matter unless it was public. We were talking about the long range here. We were not talking about making things a little better. We were talking about the long range. So we would hound him to be public, and specifically, again, using the hook to support the bill in City Council. We did that with others. We also did it on the national level with George McGovern. Now, when we took over the New York headquarters in Manhattan of George McGovern, it was during the primary season, I'm pretty sure, yeah. I think it was still primary season. The head of the New York State McGovern Committee was a member of the Gay Activist Alliance. So you had this strange thing where we're sitting in. He is before the press. He's being the head of this office, right? And quietly, you know, out in the corridor telling us what their next step is. We had people everywhere, all right? There was a time when there was a terrible episode on an ABC TV show, Marcus Welby, starring Robert Young, the good doctor that everybody loves, and the sage, you know, of it all. And there was this terrible episode having to do with homosexuality, which of course was a sickness and all of this. And so we decided, again, probably through an ad hoc committee, we decided that we were going to do a sit-in in the office of the president of ABC. Easier in those days than it would be now, since the fears of terrorism. In those days, you would simply pick a crowded time, like lunchtime, a lot of people going in and out. We would get into not one elevator, but 3 or 4 elevators. One person would go to the proper floor and go into the stairwell and tape it so it doesn't lock. Everybody else would go to a floor above, a floor below, and gather together just outside that door on the stairwell. And when we were all ready, rush in. So we did that. Again, the idea was come out. The idea was getting the issue known. We even did 1 or 2 in boroughs. We did in Queens, we did a housing, an apartment complex that we could prove was discriminating against gays, for example. And of course, the bill within the time of GAA never passed. It would not be till 1980 something when the main push then is Coalition for Gay Rights with, can't remember her name at the moment either, but anyway, it'll come to me. But what was happening was the whole society was beginning to change by our coming out. Segregation doesn't work with gays for the most part. Yes, there were gay ghettos for perhaps for the most femme or the most butch females, all right? But in general, it doesn't work. You can't segregate us. We are in every family. We're known in every family. The importance of segregation, whether you're talking about racial segregation, redlining, direct, or whether you're talking about we'll put all these stories out about the stranger who rapes women so that women don't go out alone, whatever your method is, because that's a form of segregation also, allows you to keep saying and people believing these ridiculous things that you're saying about the group. Doesn't quite work. As soon as we came out in terms of gays, it doesn't work anymore. These other things like advances in racial against racial discrimination have come out for the most part through the courts first. Gay lib is the opposite. Actually, I think the society has moved ahead of the legislature and the courts, precisely because by coming out, we're in every family. And just as when I was first coming out, was able to look at the stereotypes of gays and know that that wasn't me, right? Well, now that's also true of my friends, my family, my whatever. They also, because we've come out, know the stereotype to be false.
I'm thinking of Harvey Milk telling everybody, come out, just come out.
Harvey's a latecomer who did a good job.
Mm-hmm. Right, this is standing on the shoulders.
Right.
We're in the late 70s.
I mean, he was in the closet when he was here in New York. Came out when he was in the Castro and then running. The film is extremely annoying. The documentary film is extremely annoying because it intentionally misleads, and it's not necessary. Harvey Milk is to be remembered for some very good reasons. You don't have to make it bigger than that. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the 2 areas that strike me. Watching the film, you would think that he was the national leader against Anita Bryant. That's not true. He was a local leader against Anita Bryant. The national one's really, not surprisingly, coming out of Florida, all right? And people like Jack Campbell. The other thing, which is even more unforgivable, and obviously this is talking here about the filmmaker, not about Harvey, all right? They're sitting at the table during the campaign. He's sitting, I guess, with Cleve Jones, who is his campaign manager. And I think it's Cleve that's made to say, you know, Harvey, that if you win this election, you will be the first open gay male to do so. Technically a true story, a true statement, but there were several lesbians who had already done that. So the average person watching that film now thinks he's the first gay. He's not by several years, you know. We don't need to do that. We don't need to make, because I'm GAA, we don't have to make GLF evil, or vice versa. We both had an important part to play, all right, or the Mattachine Society for that, or Daughters of Bilitis, or any of them. And the same is true of individuals such as Harvey, or Denny Covello speaking at the, or going down to the convention, Democratic Convention, or any of that. There's plenty of just kudos for all.
And paths, you know, to do it
right.
GAA, when does GAA end?
Good question. I had left town by then. So I think in an official sense, probably in 1977, all right? Now after 1 year of presidency, I was debating whether to run again. And Bruce Voller wanted to take over. And in our discussions with each other as part of my decision to run or not, he assured me that he was fully in favor of keeping a GAA as a democratic grassroots organization. I didn't run, he was elected, and I'm not sure exactly the time, but certainly within 6 months, if not shorter, he left GAA to found the Gay Task Force. And his idea of the Gay Task Force, now the NGTLF, was a board of directors run organization. And even the board of directors it's more an executive director run, initially of course him, organization. And he, indeed I was invited initially along with others to be on the board, and went to a meeting or two and then declined once I realized that's what he was doing. I mean, certainly in the long run, you also need that kind of organization. All right, definitely. But he did it in a way that helped, well, I don't know. It's hard to say for sure whether it would have happened anyway or in the same time span or not. So GAA continued on after that. I was out of town very shortly after that. And you had Morty Manford, and you had some other people. You had members of the SWP also, Socialist Workers' Party. The Socialist Workers' Party, today I will gladly call myself a socialist, and in many ways have been for even then, okay, although I wasn't necessarily using the term. But I always viewed the Socialist Workers' Party the way I viewed any political party. They're out for what they can get, all right? So as president of GAA, I was invited indeed to speak to one of their meetings in New York. And my message at that thing was essentially what I just said. Show us what you can do. I'm going to, especially as GAA, who is not going to endorse any candidate of any kind, I'm going to treat you the same way I would treat any other political party. Well, when their newspaper came out, to read that newspaper, I was all in favor of the SWP. All right, so I never trusted them particularly, but not that I trust Democrats or Republicans or anybody else either, but it was that kind of relationship. But they had the presidency for a while. The last one might have been Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy has written a small book, almost pamphlet, about the last days of GAA, which I think is dated in 1977. But certainly its heyday is over by 71 or so, 71, 72, something like that.
I'd like to, at the expense of going on forever, end off by, earlier, probably about an hour ago, you mentioned, how Mattachine in its own way gives way. It's the foundation of the things that happen with Stonewall,
Mhm.
and then the GLF and the GAA, and then you bring it over to ACT UP.
Mhm.
And I was just hoping you'd talk a little bit about how you see ACT UP as GAA or GLF as ancestors of what ended up happening with ACT UP.
Well, you can trace it both in who its founders are or early members are. In the case of ACT UP, the Lavender Hillmar people like Bill Baldwin, who was in GAA, for example, was very much involved in ACT UP. So you can trace it that way, but you can also trace it in terms of tactics. ACT UP, of course, is known for their, what GAA would have called zaps, all right? They've added their own flavor to it, certainly. I'm not saying that they haven't added anything. No, absolutely they have. But you can see, certainly, that progression in terms of ways of doing it in the organizations as well as in the leadership, all right? Now, I've never been a member of ACT UP. Like anybody of my age in New York, I saw an enormous number of people just, I mean, from diagnosis to death was often no more than a month. So certainly I not by choice, participated in all of that. I've always, my work has always been elsewhere, recognizing the importance, certainly, of HIV-related work to this day. But also recognizing that it's not wise to put all of your stuff into one area, and we have not. I mean, there have always been other organizations in other areas that needed to be done. And again, it's part of my philosophy about organizations in general. There have been organizations that are certainly not for me, all right? Notably, the Human Rights Campaign, which is far too conservative an establishment for me. But that doesn't mean that I say that they shouldn't exist. It does mean that that's not where my effort will go. And I feel that way with the possible exception of log cabin Republicans. But I'm not even sure that that's a total exception. I suppose somebody's got to be. Certainly if it was the Republican Party of Eisenhower, I would more easily say that than the party of 45. But
well, it is becoming more difficult for them.
Yes, of course it is.
But it's interesting because I've heard people over the years, and we will wrap it up soon, say things like, "Oh, look at that quizzling queer, he's self-loathing," and so on. And I've thought to myself, self-loathing? He's on national TV, out as a gay man. You may disagree with him on the military and economics, but I don't think he's necessarily self-loathing,
Or at least no more than the rest of us. I mean, I don't think it's possible for us to wholly eliminate internalized homophobia.
I think in the last 5 to 10 years, I've come to the conclusion that I won't.
Right.
And I'm going to stop giving myself a hard time about that. Somebody said, it may have been Jim Forat who said, or somebody else said, Harry Hay, when Harry Hay spoke about gay spirit, he talked about this thing that kept us going regardless of that stuff.
Right, yeah.
And that was very helpful. Are there any questions that I didn't ask? Well,
probably, I don't know.
Is there anything that you would like to add to this, to the Stonewall archive?
I think now, yes, right. There's a couple of things, a couple of related things. It has become in vogue among certain groups to make a pretense of Stonewall being the work of one part of our community. If you look at the actual history, and my main source here is the excellent research done by David Carter, all right. If you look at that, you see that virtually every segment of our community was involved in the Stonewall riots, or the Stonewall Rebellion, if you prefer. The first person arrested happened to be a woman. There were transgender people, or those days we would have said drag queens, who gave them lip. There were street people who were homeless or near homeless. There was also the majority of the bar patrons would have been white middle class, young white middle class. So virtually every segment of our community in one way or another was involved in the Stonewall Rebellion. And of course the left activists who then made sure it went somewhere afterwards are also important. So I get annoyed when I hear, and these days it's usually transgender who is said to be doing this. They gave us the whole thing. They were an important part of it, as were a number of other groups. And it's important that that be recognized. But it's also important that it be recognized that it was not all one thing. All right, our strength is to the degree that we can maintain this common, if not unity, at least this common cause. And the fact, of course, in today's world, as in then, is there's a great deal of prejudice within the LGBT or the communities against bis and against transgender people. And my preferred area at the moment, again, keeping in mind that many things have to be done, this is the area that I'm looking at the moment, right, is indeed within the community itself, to learn how and then to be a true ally for transgender and people who choose bisexuality as an identity. These days, I go a couple of times a week to a gay senior center, okay? Well, most of my life, since I have come out, has been in an activist community, okay? The Gay Senior Center is wider than that. I'm certainly not the only longtime activist at that senior center, but on the other hand, there are a great many people who have never been activists at all. And so I see directly from time to time prejudice against transgender and against bisexuals. And indeed, clearly it's an LGBT senior center, but clearly the missing element is the T, and I can see why. I don't think they'd feel comfortable there, all right? So those are the areas that I would like to work on now.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Cool. Including Jim Farrell.